Good evening, everyone. Welcome to State Library Victoria. My name's Sarah Wills. I'm an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. It's my real pleasure to be a host for this event this evening, which is part of a very important partnership between the University, State Library of Victoria and Black Ink. All three of our organisations occupy unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge their cultural knowledge and practices. Our event tonight is on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and so I pay particular respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Supporting the integrity of Indigenous collections, knowledge, promoting forms of two-way learning is important work that we all should be doing in partnership. Speaking of partnership, welcome to Writers on Writers, an initiative developed as part of the partnership between the University of Melbourne, State Library Victoria and our publishing partner Black Ink. The program was developed to raise the profile of Australian literature, and in total now 9 books have been published, each one by an Australian author on another Australian writer, giving leading contemporary authors the chance to reflect on those writers who've inspired and influenced their work. And it's, of course, Helen Garner's work that is the focus of our attention tonight. And if you haven't already, please take a look at the superb selection of Garner's works, first editions from the library's collection located towards the back of the room, which were generously donated by Graham and Anita Anderson, who we also warmly welcome here this evening. Writers on Writers offers the opportunity to consider, who do our writers read and what impact does that have? It generates insight into what writers learn from each other and how the craft of writing develops. I think this is very evident in the edition that we're here to launch tonight, On Helen Garner by Sean O'Ban, another terrific pairing as it turns out. Sean O'Ban is a bookseller, a book critic, and his reputation as an exciting literary talent was announced particularly with the publication of his first book, the satirical short story collection, A Couple of Things Before the End, in 2020. Helen Garner herself noted that Sean's superb rendering of his characters' voices in this collection both threw me into fits of laughter and slyly broke my heart. And it's fitting also, I think, that our other guest tonight has had high praise for Sean's previous work, describing it as complicated and savage and difficult and funny and melancholy. It's both harsh and a caress. And I thought of this as I started reading Sean's opening lines in this new book, and I'm very pleased to be handing over to Christos Tsiolkas, one of our university's favourite alumni, make sure I get that in, and a past contributor to Writers on Writers, to lead the conversation here with Sean. Christos is, of course, an award-winning author of novels, short stories, monographs, has had many works adapted for the stage and screen. He's a patron of Writers Victoria, an ambassador for many other important causes. He's on radio, and also he is, to my mind, one of our bravest and most honest writers about what Sean beautifully describes at the start of this book as closeness to self. The good, greedy, mistaken, emotional, fierce, sceptical, changing and disrupting self. It's going to be great to hear these two engage tonight on Helen Garner. We won't be taking any formal questions, but there will be a chance to chat to Sean about his book after the end, when you'll all be encouraged, of course, to purchase, and he'll sign them. So please give Sean and Christos a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah. Yes, the price of a question is you have to purchase the book. I like that system very much. Sean, you're... actually, to echo Sarah's acknowledgement that we are on Wurundjeri land, that there is a long history of storytelling that is part of the reflection you and I do and all of us do as writers. And it's important to get to that right at the beginning, you know, that this is these are the questions that go around in our heads when we sit down at the desk and do something called writing. I've been living in your book the last fortnight, really, because it's... I did a Writers on Writers book on Patrick White, and it was... So one of the things you do when you write in this series is to try and offer your love for a writer. With at the same time to ask questions and to ask what is sometimes difficult about reading the writer, and you do that completely with Garner's work, and you've actually led me back. I reread The Spare Room, which I hadn't read since it came out, after reading your book. I'm a little bit jealous because when Chris Fike, the editor, asked me who I wanted to write on, it was Patrick White and Helen Garner. But I am so glad you did it. I did it because I think you did it with a bravery and a fearlessness that matches what Garner does. And there's a lot of things we're going to try and get through tonight. But before I ask anything of you, I would love, because the writing in this book is so precise and so searching and wonderful, can you give us a taste of it?
Thank you. All right, I'll just read a short amount, and then I'm pretty extraordinarily grateful to talk to Christos, and I really want to get ahead and talk to Christos. So I'll just read a little part from the start of the book, which hopefully gives some sense of the way I tried to mix myself, never lose a sense of what it was compared to Helen Garner's, but also bring enough of it so that it, I don't know, was properly and honestly making me say more about why I really needed her. All right. So, I grew up in the outer suburbs with a pretty heavy load of bloke over me, being told by my male relatives that anything new is idiotic and there are really maybe only 4 things to do, only 4 choices of activity: footy, cricket, eat stuff, watch TV, go for a walk. And even when I got further away from the house, there didn't seem to be very much more that was possible. This was in the bleaker, more concreted and tan-barked Australian outer suburbs in the mid-1980s, in what was culturally a much more bloke homogenous, sport homogenous situation in our country. What it all gave me was the feeling, not the reality exactly, it's not like anyone imprisoned me exactly, but the feeling of being surrounded every day by nothing but a bunch of blokes going, we're all doing this, we're all playing cricket, we're all kicking the footy, you should do that, you should do that, you should do that. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But even as a kid, you know that there's something wrong with what you'll make out of all this. You can sense and are ashamed of and confused by what are or might be your overreactions. I knew my parents loved me. I knew they didn't mean to hurt me, really. I knew even as a little kid that there was something wrong in reacting as if it was an assault to go to Gels Park for another family barbecue. That it was not an intended assault, it was a kindly assault, a kind of, I never meant to hurt the boy's feelings, Jesus, I thought it might be nice if you went outside for 5 fucking minutes, boy'll go blind if he stays in here reading all day, kind of assault. The guilt comes because everybody has a right to ask, why don't you want what we want? Don't you like us? Any group around you can fairly ask that. You hurt them too. But the problem of your little self can't be reduced beneath a certain point. You will be stuck managing a consciousness that always seems so stubbornly local to your one brain and body. Though the comedy and pathos of being a kid is that you don't know this. The problem of you is both enormous and something you think you maybe shouldn't have at all. You think to yourself, it's not like bigger things in the world. It's not like politics or anything. And the shame and the confusion is that to you it is like a politics, is just like a politics, as big as a politics. It's so stupid to feel this, so shameful. To you it's the fight over the government of you, the continuous fight over this ridiculous, tiny, but to you, very valuable territory. Now, imagine bringing all that to monkey grip. I read it when I was 17. What got me, what still gets me, is the concentrated amount of self that's in it. Monkey Grip is saturated in one consciousness, Nora's consciousness. And seeing this, page after page, was one of the first big confirmations that things could be like this, that this is what had already happened to me, or I'd done it, and that it was contradictorily interesting and delicious and bad and lonely to be so steeped in, waterlogged with the problem of me. In Monkey Grip, everything is narrowed down to Nora. The only things that get into the book are things that are presented most directly and immediately to her senses, what she most directly and immediately feels, sees, hears. There's almost no history in Monkey Grip, no context. Nora does say that she lives in an old house a mile from the middle of the city, and as the book goes on, we're also told she has a little daughter called Grace, and that Nora and Grace live poor, with musicians and actors in one shabby share house after the other. But that's about it. After that, people and places mostly just appear. Nora will say, Clive came over, Cobby's back, I saw Martin, I saw Jessie, Javo, Lou, Selena, Willie, Rita, Ange. I went to the tower. I went with Bill to Shakahari. It's a little disconcerting at first, but soon you get the idea. You're so close into Nora, she's not going to stop and more formally explain. Now, Willie moved from Adelaide 2 years ago where his parents were both teachers, the mother primary and the father at a technical college. No. The voluptuousness in this writing, this method, is that there's no need for any of that. She's talking to you as if you already knew. It's as if you're already part of her consciousness, and so many things never even have to be explained.
Thank you, Sean. So when I read that passage, it threw me right back to my first encounter with Helen Garner was Monkey Grip, and I can tell you the place. It was on a little independent bookshop in Station Street, Box Hill, that eventually turned into a porno shop and now sells telephones, which is a trajectory of what has been happening in our culture and in our city. And I sat down. They were a wonderful couple who ran it, and I've told Helen this. I sat down and read half of it in an hour and a half, and they let me do that. And then I saved up and bought a copy. So I want to ask you about what is it that you and I responded to when you talk. The 4 things that you could be. I was told there's only 4 paths in life. One is to be a lawyer, one is to be a doctor, one is to be an accountant, and one is to be a factory worker. Those are the only options in life. Yeah. So what is it that we're responding to in Ghana at Monkey Grip before we go to university? Yeah. Before we have a language about what fiction is and what fiction isn't, what was it that you're responding to?
That's it, because you don't even articulate it really fully to yourself. It's more like you bend towards something that you know has something really important to do with you, but you don't have the language or the more tertiary educated kind of vocabulary to explain it to yourself. But what I think you're coming across is that really powerful feeling that you get in really strong literature, which is, this is the kind of trouble you're in. This is, as I said, like what's happened to you. Again, but part of what's extraordinary is that it's not like you could put the book down and explain it to anybody else. You just feel it. You have that sort of, the book exerts that kind of force on you and you bend towards it, not knowing.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true. It felt also like I was, because you talk in your essay about the them and the I, right? Yeah. About we are in our different ways, I came from a different, well, not so different world really, but feeling that I just wanted to escape them. And part of that was the blokes. Part of that was a Greek culture that I don't feel this now, but at that time felt like it was really stifling. And I think that's connected to sexuality. It felt like this book also was promising me a way out, so that there's something euphoric in it, even though it's a dark terrain that I'm responding to. And then, because I loved Monkey Grip so much, I read the Children's Bark, and I still think Children's Bark is one of the greatest pieces of writing in this country's ever produced as a fiction. And I'm still in high school, and I'm responding to her style. I'm responding to her language. I knew that it was different to a lot of the other books that I was reading. Yeah. Did you have a sense of that?
I think so. It must have, I can't remember exactly, but it must have hit me differently to, say, the science fiction I'd been reading. It must have seemed stronger and plainer, like giving more of what was really to do with what you might be most frightened of or most want, in a way that other writing I'd come across hadn't. The thing it makes me think of too, though, is rereading it in my early 20s and mid-20s, and I think more than having a sense of, not stricken exactly, but a sense of also, and without putting too much pathos in it, this is also the first thing you'll do if you have waterlogged yourself with a sense of yourself to try and fight off people around you who aren't like you. What the book shows you so extraordinarily and keeps you in so extraordinarily is the way how much you'll hope that love will get you out of it. That's so characteristic of that time in the first time, late teens, early 20s, mid-20s, where the first thing you do, maybe, some of us, is is you'll just have the most exaggerated idea of what you can do for somebody else and what they will do for you. And that's the Nora, and I never know this, do you say Javo or Javo?
Javo is what, but...
Yeah, okay. But my whole life I said Javo. Javo.
Can you ask Helen?
I think she says Javo in documentaries and things. Yeah. Javo. Javo. The thing I think that gets you too, once you get past the look how much of a self there can be, is look what happens, look what you do. You're going to want someone else too much. You're going to try and get rid of your exaggerated amount. You're going to try and give it to someone else. And the thing that Nora says to herself over and over is, sometimes I know exactly why I'm doing this. I can make a story of it to myself. And other times I can't. I will ask myself and anyone near me, why am I doing this? Why so much for him? Why Javo, Javo, Javo?
I don't think I really understood that on that first reading. I was too
me neither.
Young.
But mid-20s, yes.
Sorry?
Mid-20s,
Mid-20s,
yes.
yeah, definitely. And I think I'm trying to get to that question of the they and the I.
Yeah.
For you to explain it a little bit to the audience of what you mean in relationship to Helen's writing, and the fact that something about the confessional mode, that dismissal that, and this happened once I started getting to university. It's just diary writing.
Oh yeah.
You're right. Which I knew was sexist because at that same stage, I loved Norman Mailer, and I loved it, right? So around that time, I was a precocious child because literature was one of the things that saved me. And it seemed to me, and Philip Roth was another writer I was reading, they were doing the same thing.
Yes.
So it was a sexist thing, right?
Yes. She took particular shit in the late 1970s, and this has been, Bernadette Brennan talks about this in her book on Garner, and Karen Goldsworthy does as well in her book on Garner. They'll quote the pretty pompous male critics in the 1970s who said, things like, Ms. Garner writes quite well. Like literally, Ms. Garner seems to write quite well. However, it's being a lady and therefore amateur, that stuff. And not being nowhere near the kind of comparison you just made, or, wanting to keep her in some amateur category. And not even being able to think of all the strong male writers that had done exactly what she'd done, used the same method. But going back to what you said before, the essay I rely on a bit to try and explain this in the book is an essay she wrote called just I. It was published in Meanjin in the early thousands, and she says, she uses this image. She says, once I was on holiday in Vanuatu and I saw a clump of trees, and at the top of the trees there was a kind of parasite plant that was growing across them, or maybe it was just the trees themselves, but anyway, they were clumped, and the top of the tree was so clumped together that you couldn't tell which parts of the tree were individual. And she says, really strongly and characteristically, it filled me with horror. I had a special sense of horror when I saw this. And that word comes through really importantly in other things she does, sometimes in the essays and also especially at the start of The First Stone. When I read what had happened at the magistrate's court when I read that this man who I don't know is being accused of a sexual mistake, and it seems that the law is going to move against him this fast. I didn't think, I just felt a sense of horror, a rush of horror. And as much as you from fairly far apart think you can organise an amount of thought about that, what I think is that she experienced an overwhelming amount of bad authority from the father and in the house, and it just, in ways that made her anguished, in ways that made her superbly good at organising and reporting from herself, just made her have such a strong sense of, I'll never give up a sense of I. I'll never give up a sense of the individual. Because, and sometimes I'm never sure, sometimes, like I say here, you're never sure, and she works so hard on this throughout her whole writing life, you don't know what part of it is just what anyone could reasonably do to save a sense of self. And then you also don't know, well, what have I done? Am I too stuck in this now? Have I made too much of a separate sense of self, of individual? That can't be right. She is so, throughout her working life, moving towards saying, what are the ways in which you have to get rid of a bad sense of self? What are the ways in which you have to learn to be with, share with, make with other people? The both together, the fight between them, the accurate and equal reporting of each is mostly how I understand what she's been able to do, why it's so extraordinary. Because I think so many people will report a lot of one or the other.
Yes.
Right? They'll make an angry statement, and maybe a really competent and readable and wonderful statement of their separation. And I think like a lot of rock and popular music is that too. Like, right? Here we are, fuck it, we don't have to do anything else, go away. That's it. You can start and stop there. But what she'll say is, I have the fiercest sense that I'll get to decide, and I won't take meanings pushed down on me from above. But then she also is all the time thinking, what kind of mistakes am I making? How would that keep me too isolated, too frightened, too sad, too bitter? What kind of habit might that be? So again, her working so hard at both, and not to be too, but the lesson that I think comes out is how much the first method you use to save yourself and the family is always in danger of becoming a habit that can distort you from the get-go, in youth and then very much further along into middle age and late middle age. I think The Spare Room is partly about that. I think that's why Nicola is offered up to us, because she's somebody that's relied on her first techniques to save herself, and they're really sadly, obviously not working, but she goes to her death grouping them so tight.
Oh yeah, and it's unrelenting. It's beautiful but unrelenting and hard, that book, because you just want to shake her. That's what Helen does. That people said to me about The Spare Room, but she's cruel, and it's not. No, if I was in that situation, if I was in that spare room, she's at being honest. There's so much to go to, but just to go back to an idea about from that essay about failing, right? And you write about Cosmolino, and my relationship to that novel is a little bit of sadness, because I think what Garner did after that with The First Stone and with Joe Cinque's Consolation is astounding, right, in terms of a rethinking of what I am going to do as a writer. Yeah. But I think, I agree with you. Cosmolino, is it a novel really? I consider it a novel, but it's three stories. Yeah. Is a writer attempting to do something different and failing, but I think in the failing there's something worth celebrating. Is it that she wasn't allowed to fail? What do you think happened with that novel? She turned away from fiction for so long.
Yeah, I think I might have fallen to the needs of the story I was making in the book. But
we all do that.
Although as soon as I say that, I also think that's not true. I think it's there let me say that, I'll say what I think and then let me come back down from it, because I think you're right as well. What I think you can see going through the books from Monkey Grip, what I found really moving was the way in which she does get out of the problem that she might have had in Monkey Grip, which was highly autobiographical, mastering that, being able to deliver that much information of what we usually can't tell or share with other people, that much of the real mess of her emotion and need for this man, or the first big mistake you'll make in love. And then she says in interviews immediately afterwards, like, I can't keep going like this. It's too much. It's sort of like it's like burning fuel that you can't replenish. So she does immediately in the novella Honour and then in the children's Bark do this thing which is so extraordinary to see, where she just really quickly learns all the techniques of a more representational fiction and is as good within, I don't know how long, between 1977 and 1984. And I was really, and the other thing, one of the things that came out so strongly was, people should maybe talk more about how good Postcards from Surfers is.
Yeah.
It's so extraordinarily good. And by that point, she's just taking it to her. She's doing as much as she's just finding out just how much she can do. She'll be people quite far away from herself, then she'll bring it back. It's and it's all so well done.
I remember my friend Sasha Soldatov, who was a mentor for me, and him discussing Helen Garner, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, the reason there's jealousy is that she's an instinctive writer, and a lot of us hate that. I think she instinctively, Garner is a great writer, but I think that sometimes that can overshadow that also you still need to do the work.
Yes.
And she's doing the work. And then for me, my defence of Cosmo Cosmolino is that I can see the work is being done. Maybe the problem with the novel is that it's there, that the scaffolding is a little clear.
So just to read, to go through, and to get up to Postcards from Surfers, and then go into Cosmo Cosmolino, you do feel that most of what she's been able to do so far that is so extraordinarily good, it is something to see that it starts to just go into something that seems demonstrably much worse.
Yes.
Nowhere near as good. She's giving up the thing that she worked so hard for. So it's maybe not unfair to just say that that's going to be an experience you have as you read through her books. What you know that I don't know is that when you're a practitioner for a long time, you have to take risks. And
you have to fail.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wouldn't have enough of a sense of. So that part is more me functioning as a reader and a critic, and a bit like a greedy critic, pouncing on an amount I can see and that I can organise in a more critical sense. But also, the only thing I'd ask back is, I do think it's true though, like I wasn't being just greedy to say something and organise something when I did say, I think that it's true that a writer's sensibility can go wrong and stay wrong. I do get the sense that it was a real risk. She really did, for a while, in fiction, very strongly want to develop more towards something that really did seem the opposite of what she was needed to do, was the best at. And there's real not just my book need, but proper drama in that. And there would, I suppose, be careers in which somebody did. Zadie Smith says this, you watch a writer sometimes in the early middle part of their career, they do lose their way, stop, and they'll make books that are, some people can be, a 3-book or even a 2-book person, and it's because that something happened. They had some wrong sense of the real relation of, and in the Garner, I think it's this wrong idea of what kind of authority you can hope for. She begins to hope for really strong religious authority in a way that just disables her better selfish fiction instincts. All her adjectives and nouns start to change.
That's true.
And the thing that's so moving is then she stops with fiction, she goes straight to the first stone, and everything just snaps back. The thing that's so lovely to see is that the first stone is really quite like Monkey Grip, really. She's gone back to that first assertion, all right, I'm here, I'm going to try and talk as me, but, and I do try and say this, the thing that she says is, instead of just getting waterlogged in me, I'll make an extraordinary report of my emotion, the true state of it, but I'll now take it out in public and I'll make it fight with everybody else. I'll read that report of what happened to this man at this magistrate's court, and I'll have what could be thought of my hot overreaction to it. But here come the year or 2 years where I go to everybody around and I force this maybe pretty exaggerated sense of self and self-threat to get into a proper exchange. I'll make this thing go out and fight and learn from people. And that's the work of the first stone.
And so, to get to the first stone and to be really, honest about where we are with that book. And, I'd finished university by then. I'd been working for a while. My memory is that I'd just come back from overseas. My partner was working at Ormond College where the events had happened. And there had been an absolute fury from so many of my friends about that book, right? It was seen as heretical. I think I'm going to use that term, coming out of Cosmolino and what Helen's doing. And I'm interested in my response at the time because I agreed. I read that book and I thought, this is a mistake. This is an outrage. And I have reread First Stone now about 7 times over my... And what was happening in our heads, I won't make it collective, I'll ask about myself, that I couldn't see that it was a much more tentative, it was a much more gracious book, it was a much more complicated book about the they and the I and feminism and authority and power and sex. What was it that was happening in that we couldn't see it?
One thing I try and say is, because she's so honest about her rawer, her less organised emotion, one thing I think does happen is that her hottest overreactions in that book, quote, "I wanted to shake those girls until their teeth rattled," unquote. You remember that, and you don't remember the more humble, beneficent work done afterwards. You don't remember her saying, "I'm so unsure about what I think. I think maybe they were right. They've worked so hard to confront these foolish men who were so sure." Again, like the bad male critics that she had to put up with when the Monkey Grip first came out. So I think that's the risk in the method. And what's so striking, of course, is that most non-fiction gets out of it by just removing so much of the more difficult personal from a non-fiction report. The other thing I think that's happening a little is, because I remember my reaction to the book, I was 24 when it came out, and I thought I had the sort of double reaction of, I think this book is saying something true and important, but I'm also really frightened of it because I don't understand how you can say the things she's saying and still do enough good. I don't understand. I don't understand how we have to put a stop to the thing that those students are trying to put a stop to. How can you allow that much doubt and reporting of all your personal...
Isn't that, but that is a part of the problem, I think, with the nature of the criticism around Garner and this kind of almost idea that it's a birth of Venus. She came out of the sea and that she is someone engaged. She's been reading. She's been reading the writers that I mentioned before. There's a whole work around non-fiction and the placing of the I in the essay, in non-fiction. That is part of what she is also attempting to work with. And it's this notion that Garner, you read it in the diary, she is responding to the world. She is responding to writing. Yes. And it's almost like, what is it about the criticism around Garner that for a long time seemed to...
I think she is one of those writers that introduces so much of what's usually, firstly, not usually socially permitted, but also just can't be permitted. We just can't all get along. Saying as much, there is a necessary amount of repression needed for group action, for good administration, for good politics, for activism. And one thing she does that I think is really difficult, is so valuable, but also makes people so dismayed, worse than dismayed, irritated and angry with her, is that she's interfering. She's really testing the limits of the necessary repression we all have to share in to just be able to be in a room together. But her argument, and I think you do this in your work, she's intensifying that literary sense that you have to report these things, the bodily, emotional, personal, particular, that you have to do that because of the amount of the impersonal, the repressed, necessarily repressed but still repressed, that we make. I sometimes think that what she's doing can be so dismaying and make me angry, make people angry. But if you compare it to the amount of tidy, prim repression that we fill the world with, that our civilization and culture is made of.
Sean, I think for me, and I don't want to make light of it, I still have friends who won't read her because of the first time, which but this goes, I think it's ridiculous, but I also think it's ridiculous that someone won't read I make a separation. That's another argument we can have. But I think in terms of what Garner's doing, where I came to, and what made me pick up the first stone again after that reaction, because I knew these people, right? As I said, I knew a lot of the feminists who were involved in what was happening at Ormond College, is Joe Cinque's Consolation. And you quote Inga Clendenin, who I adore. I think she's an amazing writer and historian, and her dismissal, which I thought was ungenerous, of what Garner is doing in that book. And the thing that I love about that book is that she gets me into the head of Joe Cinque's parents.
Yes.
And different to what was happening in the first time, because he was not of my world. And in fact, the girls really, they were kind of in and out. I had to rely on orthodoxy reading the first stone, because that's what I had. With Joe Cinque's, when she writes, if his son had been murdered,
maybe the judge's son, maybe if they kill him, you'd understand.
I saw my parents. I read my parents. I read working class lives, migrant lives, that they're not saying the right thing.
Yeah.
They're saying the things that we don't say amongst this milieu, but it is voiced, and I just started breaking down in tears at that section of that book, which I think is a remarkable book. So isn't that what she was also trying to get to in the first stone?
Yes. And this might be tidying up what she does too much, but as far as I understand it, the argument is, and she does say this explicitly in Joe Cinque's Consolation, I'm not saying what I do replaces the kind of reasoning that a court does. The judge's
yes, she does say that.
Detachment is hard-earned, deeply hard-earned. But what she is saying is we're just not going to be able to include enough of what we really are, what we really do, what we really need, if we administrate it away. And we are, again, just surrounded by that kind of removal of the particular, the personal and the emotional. The great fight, though, that always goes through is, and she comes back to this more in this House of Grief, is, but what is it that we can only do if we do good group work together? And yes, I was thinking, it would be unbearable if a judge every time from the bench went, well, I see the accused and I just think about my brother. And I just, you know what I mean? You
don't want that.
No, it's unbearable. Yeah. But there has to be an amount of it. There has to be, the maybe clumsy phrase I say is, of the vital supplement. And that, very broadly I understand to be the argument for the literary against the, as necessary, political, activist, theoretical and metaphysical.
And a trust in us as readers to say, I can hold, right, that I do not want the legal system to work on that emotional basis, right? I can hold that, but also to say, I want to understand the grief of these parents who have lost a child. Yeah. And that is the literary, that is the thing that I think is what she does in the book. And it's what we come to. It's because we're having these conversations in our head. That's what Garner does for me. You know, you're just going, where is the Christos I in relationship to this, and when is Christos part of them?
Yeah.
And I'm just talking with you now, there's not a lot of novelists, not a lot of writers in this country who make me question when am I them and when am I?
Yeah,
and I really want to defend that aspect of Garner's project.
I promised I wouldn't talk a bunch about 7.5, but I'm now going to ask you about 7.5. Christos has just written this extraordinary book, 7.5. What I think is so remarkable about it is it seems to me that you're going even further, saying, look, I'm going to express my real anger at something that is, one of the words you use is too English, yeah? I'm not going to have this, and I'm going to make a really deliberate effort to restore the animal, the creaturely, the sensuous. I think, as far as I understand, Garner's, like what she was working for, and for the reason we were talking about before, I think, and it comes through her work in different ways, I think she feels, and she says this again and again in the books and in the diaries, if I let my sense of I out of control, I think it'll just, right? But I get the sense you're working from something else, which is, I can afford it. I think I can. Does that?
I think I'm going to bring it back to Garner. I said to Sean in an email that she's going to be the Southern Cross. We're going to be guided by that.
But I can't not ask because it's so...
Yes, but what I will say is, and what makes me think about... So there was a period, and this is before 7.5, where, you get inspired by the writers you love, right? And I was thinking, what is the court case I'm going to sit in and do what Garner's doing? And then I realised I could do that, but actually that didn't feel instinctively right to me in terms... So I'm kind of there's something in fiction that I want to do that is trying to get... it's like, if she's the Southern Cross, I want to do it through fiction. And that's where you get to in the end of the book too. Okay. We love this person's writing. We've been inspired by it. What is it that you want to do that she does, but what is it that you don't want to do?
Yeah. For me, it always comes down to the question of how much impersonation, because the method I found to get out of what I was stuck in enough was what I say is the more common fiction method, which is pretending to be other people. And I don't want to poor mouth it, because one of the things I had to fight off here was she talks so much more directly from herself. Well, that makes what I do the more common fiction impersonation method, making myself into Wayne or Brian or whoever, and having him say a bunch of things. You can get stuck in a kind of thinking that it's just sort of not as honest. Why don't you go out and say it as yourself, fella? But I've been trying to, it forced me to hold on to it though, as that it's just true enough without necessarily attacking myself for it, that the way to get out of what you are stuck in sometimes can be just to say, what if I'm someone else? What can I say? What could I say? And I did say, my God, think of all the books that are made like that. Think of all the books where the person doesn't come. And I think the last thing we want is literature just to all turn into autofiction. To talk as other people is beautiful, and so much has been done of it. But I think whatever method you use, you'll sometimes attack yourself for it. And Garner sometimes says the strongest things against herself in the diaries. I hate what I do, barely metamorphosizing other people's lives, my own life. I've got to find a different way to do this. So whatever method you use to try and be literary, I think you'll attack yourself for it. But it was the thing I thought I was trying to do was to pay tribute to what she teaches me about trying to do the hard work of seeing what the risks in the method you use are to make the hardest fight against the habit that your first effort to save yourself could always be turning into. That's like separate from the beauty of the writing and the things she tells me about just the world. That's what I take away. Look hard at what you're doing and don't try and work so it doesn't become a habit, the thing you rely on too much to save yourself.
Well, I think this bloody time is there, so I'm conscious we have... but I think that is what you do in this essay, Sean, is to say, we're not all going to be Helen Garner, and we may not. That's not what we want, because we can't be. But also, it may not be the path in terms of the writing we want to do. But it just came in my head. But that notion, she's not Venus in opening up from the shell. This is someone who is thinking very, very strongly all the time about what is it that I'm doing. And as you said in the diaries, she's her worst critic.
Yes,
as we all are in terms of the fears we have. I mean, I will, because you asked, I realise that I can't do what Garner has done in something like The First Stone or Joe Cinque's Consolation. I wrote a book, 7.5, which the main character is called Christos Tsiolkas, but really to know who the Christos is to read the story he writes within the novel, because that's all we can. That's what we do is fiction, and I think there is an element of that is in Garner's work as well. That you are going to understand something of what happened at Melbourne University back then. You're going to understand something that happened when this person murdered the child of these people. But it's not going to be the complete story, because fiction can never do that.
No.
And so where I'm going to... Even though I can't call her a fiction writer because so much of her work is non-fiction, to me Helen Garner is always going to be a fiction writer. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean that in the best possible
I think that's
way.
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's right. She's purest is a word you never want to say. She's the strongest defender and worker for what I understand as the literary. I sometimes, that I think we have. She has worked and slogged to use the methods of close attention to what seems to be, your own history, your own feelings, your own emotion, and always to fight to see if it can be tested enough against other people and justified.
My friend, you've really honoured Garner in this book. It's a wonderful essay, Sean. I really mean it. It has been the world I've been in the last fortnight in the best possible way, because it's making me think about what the hell is it that we do, all of us in this room. How do we think? How do we write? How do we communicate? Please buy this man's book, and please thank Shauna Byrne for this wonderful essay. Thank you.
Please thank Christos Tsiolkas more.
What an extraordinary privilege. Thank you. To sit in on a conversation that is revealed, articulated, clarified, underlined, not only what's so important about the writing of Helen Garner, but the two writers we have here tonight as well, because we know they have something. We've wanted to bend towards you because we know they have something important to tell us about ourselves, about themselves, about society, about our literature. Thank you. It must, let's give them another round of applause. I think this must all leave us wanting more of that vital supplement, as Sean described it, of literature. So I encourage you to seek out more of the Writers on Writers series, the previous publications, either at reading stores or via Black Ink. I'm pleased to let you know that the next publication in the series is Geraldine Brooks on Tim Winton, which will be launched in October. And there's more. Sarah Krasnerstein on Peter Carey will follow that. Yeah. Oh, somebody's even spilt their glass at the thought of that. I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge some of our friends and colleagues that support this series, the Schwartz family, staff from Black Ink, Chris Fike, Kate Nash, Sarah Slade, Helena, Susie and Carlos from State Library Victoria, and Mark Rubbo and the whole readings crew as well. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. Please purchase a signed copy of On Helen Garner from readings on your way out.
And then you can ask a question.
And that's right, and you will can pay the price of the question. We really do look forward to seeing you at another literary event soon. Thanks everyone for coming, and good night.